So we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jenna and I'm a clinician at the Kellen Foundation. We are offering a training today intended for allies. And if you wouldn't mind, Melvi, going ahead and pulling up that first slide for me.
Absolutely.
I'll continue to admit people as I see them. So if you're waiting, or if you waited in the waiting room there for a little bit, I apologize. So again, my name is Jenna. I'm a clinician at the Kellen Foundation, and I just want to give you guys a little bit of information about what the Kellen Foundation does here in the Guilford County community. So the Kellen Foundation has a mission to build resilient children, families, and adults through behavioral health services, victim advocacy, and community outreach. We have been programming since 2016, but we've been established since 2013. We offer services across the lifespan, and we use a trauma-informed and resilient-focused framework in those services. We've served over 10,000 people per year since opening, and a lot of this programming is geared towards those who otherwise could not afford or could not access care. Next slide, please. So, the Kellen Foundation is nationally recognized as a top-rated center of excellence. We are recognized by the NCTSN network, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, as well as the Center of Excellence for Integrated Care, which means that we offer services for dual diagnosis, for substance use, and for your mental health needs. We've been recognized by the United States Department of Justice, as well as we provide trainings such as these for the community internationally as well on building trauma-focused and community response models and victim service delivery. 2020 was a big year for us. We were deemed the 2020 Best Counseling Agency in Greensboro, as well as the 2020 Nonprofit of the Year in Guilford County. So we're really proud of those accomplishments, and we are looking forward to continue to do this good work in our community. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit about some of the services that we do at the Kellen Foundation. Again, we offer services across a continuum of care. So we do prevention and coordination work, secondary prevention and victim advocacy, crisis stabilization, case management and patient navigation, outpatient services, school-based therapies. We do that work with the co-occurring disorders, so the mental health plus the addiction services, peer support, as well as youth empowerment and leadership. And along those lines, I'd like to take just a moment to highlight a new program that we have at Kellen Foundation in our outpatient therapeutic services as part of this continuum of care. And that is the Upswing Grant. So the Upswing Grant is really focusing on adolescents from 10 to 18 who are either BIPOC or LGBTQ plus. So we are now offering those services in the community, and we are definitely open for referrals. So I wanted to share a little bit about our speaker today. We are so super excited to welcome Melvi Shaw. She is the LGBTQ Center Manager at Guilford Green Foundation and LGBTQ Center. So after about a decade working in Los Angeles in the film and television industry, Melvi returned home to us here in Greensboro, where she began working to help the community that she grew up in. She spent time as a volunteer working with families who sought shelter from deportation through the Sanctuary program before she was hired as the LGBTQ Center Manager for Guilford Green Foundation. Managing Greensboro's first LGBTQ center is one of her proudest accomplishments. The Guilford Green Foundation and LGBTQ Center first opened the center's doors 3 years ago. They've averaged more than 100 visitors per month just in that first year. And because of this, it gave them cause to expand the scope, the size, and the reach of the LGBTQ Center. And so they moved to downtown Greensboro back in January 2020. They continue their efforts to support the local LGBT community. And so we are so grateful to have Melvi with us today so that we can learn from her vast knowledge and expertise. And so Melvi, without further ado, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much. So today we're going to be going over a number of different topics, but um, Jenna did a great job just kind of giving some information about me. I wanted to give a little bit more information about our organization. We do thrive to bring the LGBTQ community together as one here in Greensboro and try and provide an equitable and accessible space for the entire community. We have been around for over 20 years. The foundation will actually turn 24 next year, and we are excited to continue to do the work that we are doing. I'm going to kind of go ahead and roll right into our presentation today. These are some of the topics that we're going to go over, and it will be a lot of information all at once. And at the end, we'll have a resource page that will include some of the videos and resources that you see here in this slide, but I will also make sure that my contact information is listed in the chat. We are here to be a resource for all of you, for anyone. We're happy to answer any questions you may have in a non-judgmental way. We're here to basically just support the community, and that includes allies and folks who do not consider themselves LGBTQ, but do consider themselves friends of the community. We want to kind of start the presentation off today with just a little bit of an LGBTQ 101. It's just a way to kind of familiarize yourself with some of the topics that we'll talk about. And as we go into some of those topics, we'll get into more detail. If there's anything we discussed today that you'd like more information on, please don't hesitate to drop us a line. We're happy to talk, happy to send you resources and more information. This is just a great video that we like to use.
Hey
and we'll just let
everyone,
it go.
welcome to this super neat introduction to some concepts within the LGBT community. There are so many buzzwords, vocabulary, and definitions floating around in the media, it can be hard to dissect what it all means. So, this brief video will introduce you to some basic concepts. Okay, there's a lot to get through. First, the LGBTQ+ acronym. Let's break that down. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, ally. Now, all of these words deal with one of 4 key traits every person, queer or not, has. Biological sex is the physical anatomy with which you were born. Gender identity is the personal feeling and conceptualization of one's own gender on the spectrum between male and female. Sexual orientation is the gender to which a person is attracted, either romantically or sexually, in relation to their own. Gender expression is how a person chooses to outwardly show their gender identity. In simple terms, biological sex, what you have, gender identity, what you feel, sexual orientation, who you love, gender expression, how you look and act. Okay, we just broke down the acronym and we talked about the 4 traits. Now let's put them together. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and asexual refer to sexual orientation. Intersex refers to differences in biological sex, which can also be related to being transgender, and both of those are related to gender identity. Queer is an umbrella term used by most of the community to refer to anyone who identifies as part of the community. Questioning refers to people who are, you guessed it, still questioning their sexuality or gender. Allies are non-queer folk who support and love the queer community. Now, the first idea to talk about is that of a spectrum. The LGBTQ+ community widely accepts that the 4 aforementioned traits are all on a spectrum, a scale between 2 opposite points. Traits can fall on either extreme or anywhere in between. Alright, let's jump in and start with terms relating to gender identity. First, biological sex. The extremes on this spectrum are biological male and female. These are determined mainly by hormones and organs. For males, this means testosterone, a penis, testes, and secondary sex characteristics like body and facial hair and a lower voice. For females, this means estrogen, a vagina, and the internal reproductive organs for pregnancy. Female secondary sex characteristics include breasts, wider hips, and a higher voice. Intersex is the term used to describe people whose combination of hormones, internal sex organs, and genitals do not fit typical binary notions of male or female bodies. Gender, another spectrum, is the scale between boy and girl. Boys may use masculine pronouns, he, him, his, and feel masculine. Girls use she, her, her pronouns and feel feminine. Anyone who identifies outside the gender binary falls under the umbrella term of genderqueer. Halfway between the extremes is gender neutral. This means someone who identifies as neither a man nor a woman. They often choose neutral pronouns, they, them, their, or a variation of the invented pronouns z, zer, z. Someone who is gender fluid may identify differently at different times. A bigender person lives their life at both extremes at different times, living both as a man and as a woman. With both gender fluid and bigender people, it is important to listen and respect the appropriate pronoun for the situation. Agender people don't identify with any gender and often use gender-neutral pronouns. So, we already established that gender identity is the gender you feel inside. When your internal gender identity matches your born biological sex, that's called cisgender. If they don't match, transgender. Transgender people experience gender dysphoria, or the uncomfortable feeling that their mind and body don't match. Often, trans people will choose to transition, using hormone replacement therapy and/or various surgeries to change their bodies to match their identity. It is never okay to ask a trans person where they are in their transition. If they want you to know, they'll tell you. Mind-body alignment also lies on a spectrum. Gender expression is how people choose to show their gender to the outside world. This refers to the ways in which we each manifest masculinity or femininity. It is usually an extension of gender identity. Each of us expresses a particular gender every day: the clothes we wear, how we style our hair, or even the way we stand. Drag kings and queens are people who explore gender as an art form. Their cross-dressing is a form of gender expression, but you cannot assume anything about their gender identity or sexual orientation based on how they choose to dress. Speaking of sexual orientation, that's our last spectrum, and it refers to whom you are attracted. On one end, we have heterosexual, or attraction to someone of the opposite gender. Opposingly, there is homosexual, or attraction to the same gender. In between is bisexual, attraction to both genders. Pansexuality is attraction to all genders, including those that lay outside the binary. Someone who is asexual is not attracted to any gender. Attraction can be broken down even further into both romantic and sexual. One is an emotional attraction, the other is physical. These attractions do not always have to align. For example, someone can be panromantic, emotionally attracted to all genders, but asexual, not physically attracted to any gender. There are several other, more nuanced prefixes: demi, scolio, poly, to name a few. Other genders such as third gender and two-spirit also exist. Some of these identities can be confusing and hard to understand if you've never been exposed to them before. But if a person defines themselves in a way that is new to you, it is okay, even important, to respectfully ask what that identity means to them. These are just a few of some offensive and hurtful terms that are used to describe some people in the LGBT community. These terms are mostly old-fashioned and are often used out of ignorance rather than malice. However, they can all be slurs used maliciously on purpose to hurt people's feelings. But the biggest message you should take away from this video is the importance of letting someone define their own gender and sexuality. Respect their pronouns, respect their chosen name, respect their appearance, and respect their choice in partners. Share this video on your favorite social media platform and spread the word. Use these new vocab words to define yourself. I am a gay, cisgender female. Who are you?
Okay, so we had a lot of information there, just kind of unloaded in a few minutes, a lot of different topics that are all part of the work that we do here at the foundation. Just want to take this opportunity to encourage you to ask questions. That's exactly what we are here for today. It is okay to ask questions. If you prefer not to ask a question in front of the entire group, you can always send a direct message to Jenna. I'm going to ask you that you send them to Jenna because I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen, but we will do our best to answer all the questions that come through. If we don't have the opportunity to answer them during the presentation, we certainly will follow up with an email and try to give you as much information as we can. Again, I'll list my contact information in the chat at some point before we wrap up today. We are an open book. Please feel free to send us any messages, emails, calls, anything. We'll do what we can to help. That video, again, it goes over a lot of different topics, but one of the things that I really like that video does is it discusses the differences between gender and sexual orientation. That is a topic that we have a lot of conversations about here at the center. It's something that can breed confusion for folks who are not necessarily well-versed in the LGBTQ community, but they are two very different things. You know, who you love and who you are not linked. You know, a lot of the misconceptions that we see about trans people, revolve around their sexual orientation. Folks want to know, why would you transition to become a different sexual orientation? And that's because transition is not about sexual orientation. It is about who you are as a person and who you want the world to know you to be. Sexual orientation is simply who you love, who you find yourself most comfortable with and want to spend your time with, want to build a family with, want to build a life together with. It's not directly linked to your gender. The two are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes they do go hand in hand. There are trans folks whose orientations will change as they transition because they grow to understand themselves better and define their orientation through their transition. Other trans people do not change their sexual orientation. You know, they have that drive that other folks have, and their orientation stays locked as it is before they start their transition. So gender and sexual orientation are two very different things. Another thing that I really like about that video is it talks about some terminology to avoid. And the one that I really wanted to bring up here today is the term transgendered. And that is transgender with an ED at the end. That term, it implies that somebody may finish transition, that there is an end game. And while most people start transition with an end game in mind, a lot of trans folks, including myself, you know, really kind of find the idea that transition doesn't necessarily end. That as you continue to grow yourself, there's more. As you continue to know yourself, there is always more to learn. There is always more that you can adapt into and that you grow to accept about yourself. Personally, I don't necessarily see an end to my transition. I don't necessarily see a hard and fast time when I would stop considering myself to be transgender. There are folks that do see that. They do want to go and live their life as they are. They want to look past a time in their life that was considered painful. The terminology for that is considered going stealth. You know, that's a trans person who does not necessarily want to acknowledge the past that brings them pain. You know, the past that is reflective of a person that they are not. But that's not the case for every trans person, and that's why we wanted to kind of talk about that term transgendered and why it may actually be a harmful term to use because it can create some confusion. Another thing that video does very well is break out the idea of a gender spectrum, as well as a sexual orientation spectrum. Traditionally, we have looked at gender as a binary, male, female, man, woman. As we've continued to try and grow and adapt to that binary, we understand that there are a lot of differences between what the stereotypical male or the stereotypical female may look like. I mean, if you're to look around the space that you're in now, if you're not alone, look at the varying characteristics of the people around you. They differ wildly. So what is it that makes a man? Is it facial hair? Not all men have facial hair. What is it that makes a woman? Is it long legs? There are women without long legs. There's just a vast variety of differences between the characteristics that we use to define gender. And given the vastness of those differences, the LGBTQ community has largely adapted to the idea that gender is a spectrum and that those characteristics can be combined to allow a person to identify as something other than the gender binary. It's where you will run into folks who identify as non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, all different varieties of folks who do not necessarily see themselves as just a man or a woman, but somewhere along the spectrum is where they find themselves most comfortable, and that's how they identify. I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen here, and give me 1 second. I'm gonna pull the chat up, see if I can keep it visible while I have my screen shared. Yep. Oh, come on. There it is. Okay. And so another term that is used in that video is the term queer. This is another term that we have quite a few conversations about. You know, for some folks, queer has historically been used as a slur. A lot of folks who grew up during the Stonewall era and before have grown into the term queer being used as a way to harm them. It's a disparaging word historically. It's a term that was used to call someone out who didn't fit the typical heteronormative ideal that so many people fall into. It was a disparaging term that really was used to kind of make someone feel uncomfortable, make them feel different, call them out for not fitting into society. That term has grown. It has grown into a new identity. It's grown into its own definition. A lot of younger folks are starting to identify again by the term queer. It's become a bit of an umbrella term that may encompass multiple different letters of the LGBTQ acronym. You know, someone who identifies as, you know, transgender but pansexual may choose to use the term queer as a blanket term to describe themselves, because it can become tiresome to try and explain what being transgender and pansexual is every time you introduce yourself. Other folks, you know, maybe they just have not quite aligned with certain identities or certain gender presentations and use the term queer because they just see themselves as comfortable in between all of it. You know, they use the term queer as an identity because it doesn't lock them into one specific orientation or one specific gender presentation. The term queer is multifaceted in that way. Given that there is the history that it was used as a slur, it makes using the term a bit challenging. But I think a little bit of history about the term may help. It's a term that has had a very wide history. It dates back much longer than most of us ever realize. And as luck would have it, I have another great video that will give you a little bit more information about that term and where it came from. I hope.
From its humble beginnings in the 1600s to its still controversial use today, the word queer has always been, well, queer. Queer can mean something different to everyone who uses it, and we love it for its versatility and its resilience. So, how much do you really know about the history of the word queer? The Oxford English Dictionary credits the 16th century Scottish people for coming up with the word queer in the flighting of Dunbar and Kennedy, a poetic war of words that involved accusations of sexual perversion or weakness. Picture a rap battle, but in kilts. Hey, here comes our own queer clerk, one rogue battler tells another. But the guy's not necessarily gay, just eccentric and suspicious. The first person to use the word queer as a homophobic slur was John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry in 1894. His son Francis was the private secretary to Lord Rosebery, and the two were rumored to be carrying on a scandalous affair. After Francis died, his father wrote a letter to his younger son, Lord Alfred Douglas, denouncing snob queers like Rosebery and blaming the Lord for the elder son's death. The thing is, Alfred himself was one of acclaimed author and so-called first modern homosexual Oscar Wilde's literary muses, and they wrote each other love letters for years. When Douglas found out about the affair, he made it his personal mission to take down Wilde, and it worked. Wilde was later arrested, eventually found guilty, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. Other, crooked, and bad became synonyms for queer for years, and the use of the word queer reached its height of popularity in the late 1920s, as the term also became widely known in America. But New York's Stonewall riots in 1969 marked the beginning of the gay rights movement in the US. And from the start, members of the community called themselves queer as an act of defiance, as they celebrated their right to love who they want, even in the face of police violence. Yet that age of sexual liberation in the 1970s turned into tragedy in the 1980s. More than 16,000 Americans died of AIDS-related complications in just 5 years, most of them gay men. The AIDS crisis sparked an era of activism in a time of grave crisis, and this had a large influence on young activists, who took up the word queer as a badge of courage. This culminated in the founding of the Queer Nation in 1990 as AIDS continued to ravage the LGBTQ community. And at New York Pride in 1990, they passed out, "Queers read this. Being queer is not about a right to privacy. It is about the freedom to be public, to just be who we are." For the first time, the world was hearing, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." The work of these queer activists inspired a shift in art, culture, and academia, as institutions question the heterocentric norms of Western culture. With the rise of the internet came digital queer communities and a new wave of LGBTQ activism. Bills like Prop 8 in California and the larger national fight for marriage equality moved a new generation of activists to organize and fight for equality. The internet's ability to connect people and spread information at a rapid pace cemented the term queer into a modern generation's lexicon. Now, a wide range of LGBTQ people and other sexual minorities call themselves queer as a more expansive and expressive umbrella term for their sexualities and genders. Also, not everyone in the LGBTQ community loves the word queer. There are plenty of trans folks and older gays and lesbians who just don't jive with the term. But As our movement evolves beyond just the L and the G in our ever-growing acronym, the proliferation of the term has been seen by some as an overwhelming positive, reflecting a more inclusive approach to our politics and our community. We're all stronger together and queerer than ever.
So that video does a great job of just kind of outlining how the term queer has been adapted over the course of its use. It started long before it was ever used as a slur against the LGBTQ community. It's had a variety of meanings that have derived across history, and it continues to be adapted and used. Yes, it does have a negative connotation for some folks. It can be harmful for some folks, but for other folks, it is their identity. It is who they are. And given that, we try and respect both sides of that situation. For folks who tell us that queer is harmful to them, we're careful about how we use the term. But we also want to respect that people identify with that term, that it is becoming more and more common for folks to use that term as an expression of their self. It doesn't make the conversation easy per se, but hopefully some of this information can give you different points of view. And as you continue to meet more and more LGBTQ people, hopefully this term is something that you will feel comfortable using, but also feel comfortable respecting if someone tells you they're not comfortable with you using it. That's the approach that we take here at the center. We will use the term when someone says that it is part of their identity. We think it is okay to allow folks to identify as queer. It's part of who they are. It's their expression. But we also want to acknowledge that it's been used to harm people in the past. And so if someone tells us that it really bothers them, we again will try and respect that and manage the conversation in a way that's respectful to them. Again, it doesn't make it easy, but hopefully it's some information that will help you down the line. Given that the term queer is a bit of an umbrella term and is being used to encompass more and more differing identities and orientations, we see people asking, well, how do I get to know the person in front of me? If queer is supposed to be a representation of multiple letters of the alphabet at times, the LGBTQ acronym at times, how do I know who this person is in front of me? And that'll bring us on to our next topic, which is pronouns. And pronouns are a great way to get to know the person in front of you, get to know the person that you're having a conversation with. You may have seen people start to list their pronouns in their email signatures. If you're actually able to see the video screens, you may see that my pronouns are listed by my name here on Zoom. You may also have folks that are introducing themselves with their pronouns or asking you what your pronouns are. And that's not something that's meant to question your gender presentation. The way that we look at it here at the center is it's a way to level the playing field. It's a way to kind of offer some respect from the start. The English language is built on gendered speech patterns. There are ways in which we gender things through our language just all across the board. I mean, how many of you have given your car a name? Did you give it a male or a female name? How many of you refer to your pets as good boy or good girl? And if you do refer to your pet as good boy or good girl, why do you do that? Does your pet understand what boy means? Does your pet understand what girl means? They probably have some biological understanding of the differences between a male and a female dog or cat of the same, variety, but they don't understand English. Boy and girl are English terms, and we use them with animals who don't understand English. So why do we do that? And why is that such a big part of our language? What's a classification system? It's a way for us to know who we're talking to know what we're talking about, to give inanimate objects character. It's a way to just kind of align with certain things. But is it 100% necessary? I can't answer that question. I'm not a language specialist, but it is a question that gets popped up more and more often. Do we need to move towards a more gender neutral language pattern? Again, that's a really difficult question. I think if we were to try and change the English language to be completely gender neutral, we not only would have a lot of pushback, but it would make things extremely confusing. That said, I think it's important in our daily lives to kind of recognize when we're using gendered language and know where it's coming from. Ask ourselves, is it necessary? Do you have to change your speech patterns? Not necessarily, but acknowledging when you're using gendered speech patterns unnecessarily is just something to kind of consider. It's a way to kind of get to know how you speak and communicate better. We also have terms that evolve. We have terms that change and shift and will continue to grow. The term dude there, when I grew up, that term was very much used for men, used for people who were your bros. They were used for boys. Now that term is adapted a more gender neutral connotation. A lot of times people just use dude as an expression. It doesn't even necessarily have to refer to somebody. It's, dude, it's a reaction. That term has changed. Originally, that term was something that I knew to be assigned to cowboys. Now it's just something people yell out when they're surprised, they're excited or happy. You may also use that term again as kind of like a gender neutral way to refer to somebody without getting too specific. So we do have gender neutral speech language patterns throughout our English language as it currently exists. And again, our language is constantly adapting and changing. So if our language is adapting and changing, what is the best way to communicate with each other? Well, it's to ask. It's to ask someone how they would like to be treated. And that's the way that we view using pronouns. Typically, when I ask for someone's pronouns, I'll introduce myself. Hi, my name is Melby Shaw. My pronouns are she, her. May I ask your name and your pronouns? That is a way for me to extend a courtesy to somebody up front to say, I want to respect who you are from the start and get this right. I want you to feel comfortable telling me how you would like to be treated, and I will do my best to treat you that way. It can be a challenge to kind of try and insert that into your daily patterns, to try and break up the way that you speak. A lot of times when we speak, we go on autopilot. We'll just talk and talk and talk without thinking about it. Our brain is not necessarily conscious of the next words that are coming out of our mouth. But if we can stop and pause and ask for someone's pronouns, that is a way for us just to extend a courtesy, extend a level playing field to that person that says, hey, I want to respect you and I want this conversation to go well. And I'd like you to feel comfortable in telling me who you are. Pronouns have a long history in the English language, as I mentioned. A lot of you have gone through grammar school and are probably still hearing your English professor or English teacher's words in the back of your head as I talk about pronouns. There's a very specific structure for when we use pronouns, how we use pronouns. There are times where it's okay to use a pronoun. There are times when it's not. If you're writing a sentence about somebody, you want to introduce them with their name, but you don't use their name in subsequent sentences, you may use their pronouns. That's something that I remember being established at a very early age, something that was taught during English class back in elementary and middle and high school. Given that we learn pronouns and pronoun usage at such a young age, it becomes ingrained. It becomes just a natural part of the way that we speak. And so when we have to change that natural speech pattern, it challenges us. And that's where a lot of folks kind of seem to have some hiccups over the terms they and them. We're taught at an early age that they and them are a plural pronoun. They are used to refer to more than one person. But traditionally, they and them have also been used as a singular pronoun, just not as frequently as it has been used as a plural pronoun. I know growing up, when I talking to my parents, when they wanted to ask and see who I was hanging out with, if I didn't want them to know that I was hanging out with somebody they weren't fond of, I would say, oh, I was at the movies hanging out with them. I would use that they, them pronoun as a way to kind of obscure an identity. And when you kind of see it that way, it may also kind of become a little bit easier to understand how more and more folks are identifying with they, them pronouns. They have been used as singular pronouns in the past, and it is okay to use them as singular pronouns. Merriam-Webster actually agrees with us on that. This is a tweet that they put out, I believe, back, I think in 2017. I could be wrong about that. But they acknowledge that the use of they, them pronouns as a plural pronoun is okay. It is not grammatically incorrect to use they, them pronouns when just referring to one person. Also mentioned in that video are alternate pronouns. And alternate pronouns go back to the gender binary, something that we were talking about a few minutes ago after that first video. Again, the gender binary is a classification system that promotes the idea that really only two genders exist, man and woman. That binary has become problematic once again, and we now view gender more along the lines of a spectrum. And so if gender is going to be viewed as a spectrum, wouldn't it make sense that alternate pronouns are also part of that spectrum? You know, you wouldn't necessarily want to classify someone with just two pronouns, two types of pronouns, he, she, her, if there are more than just two types of gender. And so that's where they and them become part of the process, as well as some of the alternate pronouns, ze, zir. And it can be a bit confusing, but it's important that it's okay to ask. You know, that's the purpose of asking pronouns. Hey, let me know who you are. I would like to treat you fairly. I would like to treat you as you would like to be treated. And when you can extend that invitation for someone to share that information up front, it hopefully allows them to feel a bit more comfortable in talking to you, to open up a little bit more, to know that they're talking to somebody who cares enough to get it right. And that's not a hard and fast rule. You know, that's not something where we're going to look down our nose at you and say, oh, you didn't ask for pronouns, you're doing it wrong. You know, no. This is just information that we want to put out there. We encourage you to ask for pronouns if you can. We encourage you to include that into your introductions and your communication patterns. We think that it makes communication easier. We think that it allows you to better understand who you're talking to and can, you know, clear things up and make folks feel more comfortable. Again, a lot of folks will want to boil pronouns down to biological sex, but biological sex is challenging, and it's a much wider set of varieties than just chromosomes, than just gender markers. There's a pretty amazing series of tweets by a biologist named Rebecca R. Helm, and I think there's 14 tweets in total that go through some of the differentiating factors that can change in the development of a fetus to lead to a child being born with one set of sex characteristics. And when you look at all of those varieties that are there, when you look at all of those factors that can change, the simplest things that can shift, the most complicated things that we can't even see or really understand because it's on a molecular level, it becomes a little bit easier to understand how biological sex does not necessarily make a person. It's going to drift back and forth into that nature versus nurture debate. And again, I am not a scientist. I do not have a direct answer on what is right there. Nature versus nurture is a very complicated conversation. But we do think that gender is bigger than biological sex. And given that, we think that utilizing pronouns in a way that makes the other person comfortable is just respectful. I've included the last tweet from the biologist Rebecca Helm's tweets there on this page. Biological sex is complicated. Before you discriminate against someone on the basis of biological sex and identity, ask yourself, have you seen your chromosomes? Do you know the genes of the people you love? The hormones of the people you work with, the state of their cells? Biology is complicated. Kindness and respect don't have to be. And that last sentence is the most important thing there. You know, asking for pronouns is a way to show respect. It is a way to say, hey, I'd like to get this right. I'd like to make sure I treat you fairly. And so again, kind of introducing this can be a bit of a challenge. You know, it's not something that people are used to doing right now, especially not in kind of our existing Western society. It's something that is becoming more commonplace, but it's not widely accepted yet. It presents challenges, you know, not just for folks who are not LGBTQ. I mean, even for folks who are LGBTQ, asking for pronouns can create a bit of a flurry. You know, it can create a bit of confusion. It can create anger. You know, there are some trans people who transitioned. They had a successful transition to the point that their presentation now earns them the assumed pronouns that they are most comfortable with. You know, they've gotten to the point where strangers refer to them as they want to be referred without having to ask. To ask a person who has gone through that transition what their pronouns are can remind them of a time that wasn't so good for them. It can remind them of a time that was not kind. It can take them back to a period that they've wanted to put behind themselves. Does that mean that we stop asking altogether? No, not necessarily. You know, if someone is angry that I've asked for pronouns, I simply try and explain that I'm just trying to make sure I'm speaking to you the way you want to be spoken to, that I want you to feel comfortable in telling me who you are and asking me to respect that because I want to respect that. most folks, once they hear that, they will understand. They will try and move along with that. If someone gets angry, again, just kind of try and calmly explain why you might ask for those, and then carry on the conversation. It's okay just to kind of say, hey, I ask for everybody's pronouns. And that's just a way to make sure that I'm getting it right when I'm speaking to somebody who I don't know. Move on with the conversation. The anger will subside, the conversation will continue. They hopefully will see that you are very intentionally trying to respect them. So, do we have any questions that have popped up in the chat at this point, Jenna? Because we're about to change topics, so I want to make sure I answer any that could be relevant here.
Yeah, we do. We have one question that says, can you speak to what it may mean when some people's preferred pronouns are mixed, for example, she, they, or they, he?
That's a fantastic question. The mixed pronouns can be representative of a couple of different things. It may be that somebody will use a specific set of pronouns in certain instances because it helps them get past uncomfortable questions. Other folks may be in the middle of considering what their gender truly is. They may be trying to figure out who they truly are. That's not something that happens at a specific age. It can happen at any time in one's life. People will change pronouns. I have friends who have used she, they, and he, they pronouns who now identify truly as non-binary and have adapted to they, them pronouns. There are other folks who, they understand that physically they may generate a specific type of appearance that would assume a gender. And given that, they kind of acknowledge that with their pronouns. Physically they may acknowledge that they look like a she or a he, but inside they may feel a bit more non-binary, and that's where the she, they pronouns come in. Pronouns are not hard and fast. They will mean different things to different people. The main thing that we wanted to share here is that asking for pronouns is a way to let somebody tell you who they are. It's a way to kind of open the door and start a conversation on the right foot. Just because someone uses he, him pronouns doesn't mean that later in life those pronouns don't change. Just because someone uses they, them pronouns doesn't mean that later in life those pronouns don't change. They may drift more towards these pronouns. It can be a spectrum, just like gender and orientation. Pronoun usage is not hard and fast these days. Again, we admit it's challenging. It's not an easy topic to just adapt to. It's not an easy thing just to bring into everyday conversation. Even if you do know LGBTQ people who greatly appreciate your request to share pronouns, you may run into folks who are not LGBTQ that just are put off by that question. I had a family member who, when I came out, I'm too old to learn your new name. You're just going to have to get used to that. What do you do in those moments? How do you adapt to that statement? It's a challenge. It truly is. But we at the center feel that asking for someone's pronouns and introducing that into a conversation with a stranger is a way to, I've said this a couple of times now, but level the playing field. It's a way to just extend the courtesy of saying, I want to treat you as you wish to be treated. So, okay, hopefully that helped there. And we're going to go ahead and move on to our next topic. So we felt it was important to give just kind of a brief history of transgender healthcare, where healthcare for transgender individuals got its modern start, where it currently is now, and some of the speed bumps and craziness that happened in between. Magnus Hirschfeld is a name that some of you may know and others may not, but he was a German physician, and in 1919, he formed the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. In 1910, he coined the term transvestite. It was a very scientific term. It was a term that he used to refer to the folks that he was working with, to give a clinical diagnosis, a clinical term for the people that he was trying to help. In 1918, the term transvestite was written down for the first time and defined, and was defined as the urge to present and conduct oneself in the outer raiment of the sex to which a person does not belong as regards to the visible sexual organs. And that definition, it's very clinical. It breaks it down to gender presentation versus sexual organs. it was used to define somebody who presented as a gender that was not matched by their body. And it had its use, it started a conversation. But as time grew and as more and more folks began to understand that transvestism, that being a transvestite was a thing, that term became used as a slur. In modern times, transvestite now is used in many circles to refer to a sex worker, somebody who dresses as the opposite sex for the pleasure of sex. They may dress as the opposite gender to go out and have that experience. It's a derogatory term for a lot of folks. It's a term that feels misguided and seems to attach the idea that sex is what drives transitioning, which is not true. The term transgender is what came from that confusion. It's a more modern term that is designed to kind of separate out the idea of gender from sex and biological sex, those biological factors. And the terminology continues to grow. The term transgender is now largely used as an umbrella term that may encompass individuals who are non-binary, genderqueer, and gender fluid. And that term will continue to adapt because there are more and more non-binary people who don't necessarily feel that the term transgender is right for them. And the reason that they may feel that transgender is not an accurate term for them is that a lot of folks see the term transgender as specifically referring to folks who transition from female to male or male to female. For non-binary people, being included under the transgender umbrella can create some confusion. So we're seeing more and more non-binary folks who don't want to necessarily fall under that umbrella term transgender. It's good that the terminology continues to change. It becomes more accurate. It becomes more reflective of the true community. It shows that we're listening to each other and that we're trying to make each other comfortable, that we're trying to adapt to new knowledge as it comes into play. But back to the history, as Magnus Hirschfeld continued to do his work, Christine Jorgensen came onto the scene. Christine was the first American to undergo sex reassignment surgery. She underwent that surgery through Dr. Christian Hamburger, and Dr. Christian Hamburger was a colleague of Magnus Hirschfeld. There's a direct connection there between those two. In 1952, the United States learned about Christine's surgery. The New York Times came out with a headline, GI becomes blonde beauty. That's a fairly respectful headline for that time. I don't know if the rest of the article was. It's a little bit hard to find the rest of that article. I've only really been able to find the headline as it refers to the surgery. But I was surprised when I saw that headline for the first time, because I wouldn't think that in modern, well, not modern times, but in the 50s, that a headline would be that respectful of gender reassignment or gender confirmation surgery. Dr. Hamburger continued his work and learned very quickly that surgery was not the only factor in gender transition, that there was an endocrinological, I cannot speak today. Dr. Hamburger learned that he was going to need to speak with an endocrinologist. And so he set out to find one and linked up with Harry Benjamin in San Francisco. Harry Benjamin is a name that pops up quite often in modern trans healthcare. He authored the Transsexual Phenomenon, which would become the blueprint for modern transgender healthcare. That book basically helped drive the conversation to set out standards of care for trans people. It's an ongoing process, but the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association was formed from those guidelines. And a lot of folks now know Harry Benjamin's work through the WPATH Association, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. WPATH standards of care are a new set of standards of care that have challenged the existing standards that so many psychologists, therapists, and doctors followed. It's a patient-first model that basically says, we want to help someone achieve their goal. We want to help a trans person get to where they need to be to live a successful life. It was recently adopted. It's not something that has largely been around and has been the guiding force for transgender healthcare. There are still doctors and therapists who do not follow the WPATH standards of care. And you may ask yourself why that is. And that's because there is another guideline out there, a more traditional guideline called the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, the DSM. And the DSM-4 is the addition of that manual that created a lot of problems for transgender people. The DSM-3 added gender identity disorder in 1980, and you'll notice that term disorder. That's the big red flag there. The addition was initially considered controversial, but it did ultimately allow trans people to receive care. It gave a set of guidelines to help people transition, to help trans people move to their goal. But it did also treat them as if they had a mental disorder, that they were trying to correct something, that they were trying to rid a person of an affliction. Given that, the methodology became problematic. There's a term called gatekeeping that gets used quite frequently in trans circles. That gatekeeping model of care, it meant that you had to prove who you were to receive medication. You had to live as the gender that you knew yourself to be without medication for a set period of time, 6 months to a year. And then you were allowed to get a prescription to go get medication that would allow you to medically transition. The catch there is hormones are not just physical things. They also affect us mentally. And if you're forcing someone who is transgender and has the wrong hormones coursing around their body, that experience is extremely painful. If you're telling them to live as a gender they know themselves to be, but they aren't allowed to take the medication that truly allows their brain to kind of adapt to that, it creates a lot of pain. It creates a lot of hardship, and it led to a lot of problems. It's one of the reasons why the suicide rate is so high for the trans community. And the DSM-4 continued to consider being transgender a mental disorder. When I started to transition, the first therapist that I saw still followed the DSM-4. And being a stubborn Southerner, I really didn't want to carry a letter around with me that said I was crazy. That was the requirement, that I had to have a letter from a therapist that said I was seeking help for a mental disorder. I didn't feel crazy. I felt like I was trying to get to the point that I could show the world who I was. That created a lot of challenges for me. It created some big problems for me. And it's why we're excited to see the conversation change, why we're excited to see more and more doctors consider the WPATH standards of care. Are the WPATH standards of care perfect? No, they are not. They create their own challenges as well. One of the big challenges that we are seeing pop up now is non-binary folks want some level of medical transition. Some non-binary folks want some level of medical transition. And so when they go to see a doctor who offers gender affirming care, that doctor's methodology follows guidelines set out for someone who is transitioning from male to female. A non-binary person may not want that full set of changes, or someone who wants to transition from female to male. The levels of testosterone that one takes to achieve that may not be the same thing that a non-binary person wants. And the WPATH standards of care are going to have to adapt to include that. The DSM-5 is going to have to adapt into the DSM-6 to include that, because non-binary people deserve the right to be themselves as well, and deserve the same right to medical care that everyone else does. Do we have it right yet? No, we don't. We don't, but we're getting there. It's a process. It's going to continue to change. It's going to continue to adapt. I mentioned the DSM-5. It's the newest model. It's the newest, I believe it's still the newest edition of the DSM. It did remove the idea that being transgender was a disorder. It dropped the terminology gender identity disorder and brought in a new term, dysphoria, gender dysphoria. And that's largely used to explain what a transgender person feels. It's the incongruence between the body and who they know themselves to be. Dysphoria is a term that is becoming more common. You may hear it, and that's where it's coming from. That change led to a major destigmatization that cleared a lot of hurdles for trans patients. The big one in 2014, the reclassification resulted in overturning a government policy that restricted Medicare for covering transgender-related surgical procedures. I lived in California at that time, and I remember that fight happening, and the result of that fight was not just for Medicare patients. California saw that happen, and the fight within the state to ask other insurance providers to do the same thing began. And I received a letter at one point from Blue Cross that said, we're now legally obligated to tell you that we have to provide the same care for a trans woman that we provide for a biological woman. And that letter was a very, very big step. That letter meant that insurance companies were finally recognizing that trans women deserve the same access to care as biological women. And that continues to be a major milestone. The next milestone is for that to be universally adopted here in the United States, to give more people access to care that they need to live a happy life. It's an ongoing process. There are a lot of challenges to it. There's a cost associated with it, which means insurance companies are going to push back. There's also the societal changes that have to come along with some of those logistical changes happening in the background. And so I share all of this just to kind of take you back to where we are now. The WPATH standards of care, they continue to provide that patient first model. The goal of many doctors and therapists when treating a transgender person is to help them achieve a goal. It's not to ask them to prove who they are. It's not to ask them to live an inauthentic life. They are no longer asked to spend months at a time living uncomfortably before they're allowed to take medication that will make them feel better and allow their bodies to change. It's a patient first model that is designed to really kind of get someone's life moving in the right direction very quickly. And that's very important. A lot of trans people fight themselves harder than anyone will ever fight them over this. They will back themselves into a corner before they can admit that transition is the way that they have to go to move forward without hurting themselves. And given that, by the time that a lot of trans folks walk into a doctor's office or into a therapist waiting room, they're terrified. They've fought themselves. They've had this internal dialogue that's driven them up the wall, driven them sideways. It may have manifested at times in self-harm, physical harm, cutting. Hopefully they get to that waiting room or get to that doctor's office before it manifests in suicide. There are trans folks who don't get there. That inner turmoil drives them to suicide before they can get the help that they need because they feel it's too far out of reach. It's why it's important that a patient first model falls into place here. It's why it's important that doctors and therapists work with trans people to help them achieve their goals without questioning who they are, without making them prove who they are, without making them jump through hoops to achieve milestones to get the reward of hormones or get the reward of surgery. Again, it's not perfect. It's consistently changing. There are all sorts of different types of challenges that face the medical community as they continue to try and adapt and provide better care for trans people. One of the biggest conversations that we're seeing happen right now is the fact that there are no long-term studies out there. A lot of trans people have not felt comfortable being part of long-term studies when it comes to hormone replacement therapy. So doctors don't have a lot of data to look back on when they go and try and adapt the course of medication, when they go and try and adapt the course of their care. That's changing. More and more trans folks are entering long-term studies and that data is becoming available, but it's not as accessible as it is for someone who's not transgender. It's one of the hurdles that's facing the community, and it's something that will take some time to adapt to. But it is important, and it will hopefully continue to change and take folks in the right direction. Some of the other hurdles that we face, they aren't just necessarily stuck within the medical community. A lot of the pushback that comes from a trans person seeking care comes from the outside society. Conversion therapy is still something that is legal in the state of North Carolina. There were headlines that left a bunch of folks thinking that conversion therapy was no longer legal in North Carolina, but those headlines actually meant that churches couldn't apply for state funding to support conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is still legal here, and it's still damaging. It's the idea that you can force someone not to be transgender, that you can work it out of their system, that you can convince them that it's a demon, that it's something that has to change to live a holy life, to live a healthy life. Medicine and mental health care disagree. Being transgender is not an affliction. It's not an affront. It's not meant to challenge somebody. Conversion therapy will continue to be a hot topic, and until it's not, there will still be trans people, LGBTQ people, lesbian, gay folks, bisexual folks, anybody who varies outside the heteronormative ideal. They're going to be faced with that threat, and it's a challenge that also has to be overcome. And hopefully we can overcome that challenge as we continue to change medical care and mental health care to better suit the needs of the LGBTQ community. And so why does all this matter? You know, the history here isn't to say that there's still a whole lot we need to do to change. You know, it's here to point out how much has changed and the hurdles that we have faced in getting to the point that we're at now. It's great that we have the WPATH standards of care. It's very important that those standards of care are out there and that they provide a path forward for many transgender people. That said, it's also important to acknowledge that there are going to be trans people who cannot afford to transition under the WPATH model. You know, the WPATH model includes a mental health component as well as a medical component. And for a lot of people, mental health care is something that holds its own stigma. It's something that they shy away from, or they may not be able to afford it. You know, their insurance may not offer mental health care coverage. When folks are in that position, when they either can't get themselves to a therapist because they can't align with the idea that they need mental health help, or because their insurance won't help cover the cost, where do they go? Well, I'll tell you, that was one of the biggest mistakes.
Melby is frozen on this end, so we'll just give her a few minutes here. Thank you for bearing with us. Looks like she's logged out. Let's see if she comes back on. You can use this time. Oh, here we are.
Am I back?
You're back.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Okay.
We're good to go now.
Okay. All right. I'll just go back and reshare that screen one more time here.
The joys of technology.
Absolutely. Okay, so I was telling you all about the sins in my past there. And so when folks are faced with that decision that I was faced with, you know, there aren't good choices. And I made a bad choice. I know I made a bad choice. It was not the right choice for me. And it's where it's important that there's another model out there and available to folks. And that other model is what's called the informed consent model. You know, the informed consent model means that a doctor will work with a trans person to help them achieve hormones without the mental health aspect. A lot of doctors who follow the informed consent model will still encourage those folks to seek mental health care. It's important that trans people have access to mental health care, because while you do have your body adapt and change as you would like for it to, you're pushing yourself through a second puberty. And if you're over the age of 18, you're pushing yourself through a second puberty in an adult body. And that's not a fun thing to go through. It can be painful. It can cost you in ways that you don't see. You know, you may start acting like a teenager in an adult setting. And when that happens, if you don't have that mental health aspect to fall back on, it can cost you a job, it can cost you friendships, it can cost you relationships. So it's important that the mental health care aspect is there, but it's also important that the informed consent model is out there, because it gives someone a better options than taking medication from an unknown source. You know, I do not know that what I took was actually estradiol or spironolactone. It could have been sugar pills. It could have been birth control. You know, what I know is that I had enough information to know the dosages that my trans friends were taking, and I could order it online, but I can't tell you if the combination of chemicals used to make the little blue pills and the little brown pills that I took were actually the medication I should have been taking. So the informed consent model, while it's not perfect, it is important because it offers an option to folks who maybe can't afford to do it the right way and only have worse options to consider. That said, you know, we feel that it's very important that mental health care be part of a trans person's regimen. And, you know, if they don't seek it from a therapist, maybe they can seek it from a support group. Maybe they can seek it from, you know, an outside source, whether or not they're involved with a church. That can be a way to speak to folks in their community and confide in individuals such as a priest. You know, they may have good friends who can walk along those conversations with them and be patient enough to sit through that. That's not a substitute for a mental health care professional, but it is better than nothing. And that's what informed consent is about. It's not the best option, but it is not the worst option. And if it keeps someone from making a mistake that I made, we think it's important that it's out there. And so from there, we wanted to kind of open this up to a Q&A to give you the opportunity to ask any questions you may have, to throw any thoughts out there, and just have the chance to chat. Jenna, were there any other questions that I may have missed so far?
I don't see any in the chat at this time. Lots of support, lots of gratitude. Appreciating your great insight so far. Yeah.
Sure. So to our audience out there, any questions you'd like to throw into the chats? Thank you, Elizabeth. I see that comment. I appreciate that. Okay, that's an excellent question. So we have a question that says, can you speak about our friends who are intersex and the difference between that and being transgender? So the term intersex is linked specifically to biological characteristics. And that delves into the multitude of varieties that the biologist Rebecca Helm mentions in her series of tweets. I'm now kind of kicking myself for not having all 14 of those tweets accessible on the PowerPoint. But Rebecca does a great job of breaking down the multitude of things that have to happen to get embryonic cells to a child of a specific biological sex. There are just tons and tons of different factors that can shift in that process. And given that, biological sex is largely based on the physical characteristics born, of a child that's born, whether that child has a penis, whether that child has a vagina. Intersex folks have a different biological combination than non-intersex folks. That biological combination, it may be present physically. It may mean that they have multiple parts of anatomy that are usually classified as male or female. It may be that all of their differences are internal, that their chromosomes are different, that their genes are different, that the markers on their genes that change hair color and eye color for some people have just created a different circumstance within their physical biology. The term for intersex that most of you may have heard at this point is hermaphrodite. That's an old term that's been outdated. Again, it's a term that at some point was derived into a slur and used to refer to people in a negative manner. Intersex is a bit more of an inclusive term, yet it's still a very clinical term. But it does specifically refer to biology. There are intersex people who have their gender decided for them at birth. Parents who decide that having a surgical procedure to give their child a more normal appearance would give them a better shot at a normal life. Intersex folks who have had that decision made for them before they were born, they have a varying life experience, a life experience that can potentially lead to being transgender. It can potentially lead to a lot of pain. Other intersex folks who had their gender decided for them don't necessarily see that struggle. Their parents guessed right. There are intersex folks who will have surgery to undo what was done for them at an early age. And it's an ongoing conversation. Should an intersex child be allowed to define their gender through surgery? And if so, at what point should that decision be made? Does that child have to wait till 18? And if so, do they have to go through high school living with, mixed physical sex characteristics or mixed biological characteristics that other kids in their class may not have to live with? It's an ongoing debate. And personally, I don't know that I could offer an answer that I think would be satisfactory one way or the other. I think it's important that the conversation continues. I certainly don't envy an intersex person who's had a decision made for them that they grow to understand they disagree with. But at the same time, I also can't imagine being a parent faced with the idea of having a child who does not have normal physical sex characteristics grow up and the scrutiny that child may fall under. It seems like a very impossible situation, and it's a bit of a scary one. Another thing that is facing us right now for intersex folks is, you may have heard of some of the anti-trans legislation that's being considered by our local government. There is a bill that's being considered that would prevent doctors from giving gender affirming care to anyone under the age of 18, even if the parents agree, even if the child agrees, even if there's a therapist in the mix that agrees. If that bill were to pass, it would criminalize the doctor's right to help that child transition. Yet that bill also includes a very specific stipulation that says it would still be legal for the parents to make a decision for an intersex child before that child comes of age. You know, it specifically carves out protection for parents who want to make that decision for an intersex child. And for me, that's a bit of a conundrum. It's a bit contradictory. And you know, how can you allow parents to make a decision for an undeveloped child, but not allow a developed child make a decision for themselves, or a child who is developing to make a decision for themselves with the consent of parents and a therapist? So the anti-trans legislation that's out there, it doesn't just affect the trans community, it also affects folks who are intersex. And it's got a very wide-ranging reach that is very problematic. Intersex folks have been included with the LGBTQ community because a lot of people will look at someone who is intersex and chooses to transition as a trans person. And, you know, technically they are, but there is a difference between being intersex and being transgender. You know, transgender is specifically linked to gender presentation and gender identity, where intersex is specifically linked to biology. Hopefully that helped there. Okay. So we have a question that asks, do we think the lieutenant governor can be forced out of office? Yes, whether or not that is legal or not, I can't answer. But if enough people wanted to force lieutenant governor out of his office physically, I think they could probably get it done. Should they? Would probably lead in bloodshed. That's a very, very crazy question on a very, very crazy aftermath from a very, very hard and hurting series of comments made by our lieutenant governor. If you're not familiar, Mark Robinson video has surfaced where he was behind a pulpit referring to the LGBTQ community as filth, and encourage anyone who doesn't understand that comment to come and speak with him face to face. He's effectively challenging folks to fight him over whether or not it's okay to call the LGBTQ community filth. I'm going to keep it professional here and say that, you know, Mark Robinson sounds very scared to me. It sounds like he is seeing the LGBTQ community as something he doesn't understand, and his lack of understanding broods fear. You know, he does not understand how his reality can be challenged by something he doesn't understand, and it is. His reality is being challenged. You know, do I think we need to violently go into his office and force him out? No. And do I think politically he can be forced out? I hope so, but I'm not a politician. I'm not a legal scholar, and I can't really speak to that without Googling it, and I'll leave that to you to do. So, we have another question here that says, our nonprofit would like to be inclusive with our intake forms. Do we have suggestions on what to include regarding gender and sex? And Hope, yes, anything you can do to include multiple genders, folks who are non-binary, transgender will greatly appreciate that. We understand that's a challenge. You know, changing a form doesn't just mean changing a piece of paper. It means changing the classification system in a computer, and potentially having to go back and do it for old records. But the more inclusive you can make those forms to include different types of gender, not just biological sex, or combining biological sex and gender, is greatly appreciated and can make LGBTQ folks feel a lot more comfortable in the presence of your office. We'd also encourage you to consider instituting a preferred name option for folks who are in the middle of transitioning, but maybe have not yet been able to legally change their name. If you can include a legal and a preferred name option, something that gets you through insurance questions, but also allows doctors, practitioners, anyone in your office who interacts with a patient to use their preferred name, that's also a really, really wonderful thing to do for the LGBTQ community. You know, that harkens back to the fact that a lot of LGBTQ folks are terrified to seek medical help. You know, they have a history of mistreatment. They've heard the stories from trans folks who went through the DSM-4 era and the gatekeeping models. You know, they've heard how LGBTQ folks were treated during the HIV epidemic, the stigma that came with folks who sought treatment while they were living with HIV, how poorly they may have been treated. They've heard stories of doctors and therapists and all kinds of medical professionals that have claimed religious exemption and refuse to help them because it falls outside of the religious guidelines that they follow. All of those factors can lead a person to feel extremely nervous and scared to walk into a new setting where they have to give out information that they may not want to share. It's a difficult thing to have to put that information down on a form when there's not a way to truly tell the person who reads that form who you are. So anything you can do to broaden the scope of questions about sex, questions about gender, preferred name, it's always going to be appreciated. So if there are specifics there, we'd be happy to help in any way that we can. Any other questions that we can answer there? Okay. Jenna, was there anything else that you'd like for me to touch on here?
I think it would be helpful to talk a little bit about the Z-Zir pronouns and where they came about from, and a little more information so people can be familiar with that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the Z-Zir pronouns, I'm going to go back and share my screen, take us back to that page real quick. Our new pronoun page, there you are, okay. Okay, so you'll see on this page that we have the traditional pronouns of he, him, she, her, hers, and then we have ze, zir, zirs, they, them, theirs, and then we also have ze, zim, zirs. And these pronouns are effectively pronounced very similar to these pronouns, but they're spelled with an X instead of a Z. It is another alternate set of pronouns. The video that I showed referred to them as invented pronouns. Technically, all pronouns are invented. Language is invented. It's a construct of humanity. But those pronouns, when they're called invented, it means that they were introduced after the traditional pronouns that we've grown to know. For some folks, those pronouns may seem like they are new, but the truth is that there actually are, I think, 29 sets of pronouns, that's alternate pronouns that are used across the globe. They've been used throughout different levels of history. They date back before Western civilization. They date way back. It's kind of a rabbit hole you can go down if you ever decide to do some research. And we point that out because it's not necessarily a new thing. Given that those pronouns have been in existence, it's something that other societies have learned to adapt to, and we think our society can adapt as well. It may take some time, but we think it can happen. Again, the idea that it's not new is worth expounding upon. I think one of the most interesting things that I read when I started to try and learn about the history of the Z-Zir pronouns is that there actually is an alternate plural pronoun that was critically well received. The pronoun thon, T-H-O-N. And that was a term that was introduced in turn of the century UK by an author who posed that pronoun as a way to differentiate between groups of people that you know and groups of people that you don't know. So they would be a group of friends or a group of family, someone that you have a personal connection to. And thon would have been used for a group of people that you do not have a connection to, that you do not technically know. Scholars, authors, writers across the board agreed that thon was a great addition to the English language and should be widely adopted and spread. The public disagreed. They did not start using it. It did not get picked up. It was never widely used, despite the critical acclaim, despite how beneficial scholars and writers and authors might have felt it would be. And so pronouns, alternate pronouns, they have fallen in and out of our language throughout humanity. There will be new invented pronouns that will pop up probably before we can blink. More and more folks are identifying as non-binary, and they're finding new ways to share who they are. These alternate pronouns are one of those ways. They are a way to say, hey, with my pronouns, I hope you can understand that I don't fit into the traditional role of man or woman, then I align somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, maybe multiple points on the spectrum. I may also move back and forth between the spectrum. That's where the term gender fluid comes into place, or gender queer. These alternate pronouns are a way to share that with somebody without having to necessarily explain that every single time. That works when folks know what those pronouns indicate. It's not as beneficial when folks don't know what those pronouns indicate, which is why we make sure to share them in presentations like this and talk about them. And we think a wider understanding of what those terms indicate can help communication practices down the line, because that's really what it's about. It's a way to keep a conversation going and just for someone who's non-binary to let you know who they are, to let you know that, hey, through my pronouns, I hope you can correlate the idea that I'm non-binary. I hope that answered some questions there. I really need to make sure I get some of those other pronouns included in there, but they aren't quite as relevant because they're not historically relevant, I guess. They're not used in modern language, but they have been used historically. So if anybody has more questions about that, please feel free to let me know, and I'll make sure to get some of that information together and send it along. I'm going to take a moment here and paste my contact information in the chat. Forgive me, I'm copying and pasting an email signature here. And so that is our contact information there, as well as my direct email address and direct phone number. If there are any questions that we can answer, please, at any time, feel free to drop us a line, send us an email. If you don't want to attach your name to it, create a fake email address and just send it anonymously. We will answer that question. If we don't have an answer for that question, we'll hop on a search engine and try and figure it out for you. Try to send you some resources that may help define an answer for you. That's exactly what we're here for. And it's part of what we want to offer as part of these trainings, and just, as our purpose here at the center. I also want to take one more opportunity to share my screen and bring up some of the resources that were shared during this presentation. We will include these resources in an email after the fact. Okay. Oops, I may have lost my resource page here. Okay. No, I didn't. It's still there. Okay, there we go. So here on this page, you'll see some of the videos that we included. We also have a link there to the Safe Zone training, which is a wonderful training, and we encourage you to explore it as a possibility for any group that you're involved in, whether it's an office, community group, religious group, anything. It can be a very valuable training for groups to create a safe space, create a welcoming and affirming space for everyone, not just the LGBTQ community. The LGBTQ youth report is included there just to kind of give you an idea as to what LGBTQ youth are currently going through. It's kind of staggering what today's youth still face. A lot of folks understand that we live in a more accepting society, but there's the misconception that means that it's better for all LGBTQ youth across the board. There are still a lot of challenges that LGBTQ youth face, not just within their interpersonal lives, but in schools and family and everyday experiences around their community. Anything you can do to make spaces for youth more inclusive and affirming is highly, highly encouraged, because LGBTQ youth really need to find a place where they feel safe. We provide that here at the center, but we hope that we won't be the only place in Greensboro that does that. We do know that there are other places that do as well. I encourage you to help try and make any of your spaces that you can affirming for LGBTQ youth. Our website is listed there, and there's another video there, 5 tips to being a better ally, and a video about why pronouns matter that can just kind of give you some more information about the topics that we discussed here today. And I also want to bring up this other slide here with the contact information for Kellen Foundation. We really appreciate the opportunity to partner with the Kellen Foundation and be part of this. It was a wonderful opportunity, and we really, really thank them for considering us. Jenna, thank you for your time and kind of getting this moving today.
Absolutely. We're so grateful that you could chat with us today and share your knowledge, which is extensive and it's long going, and it's not something that is new, which I think is really helpful for all of us to hear and to be attuned to. So yeah, we just want to make sure that you guys have these resources. They will be in the follow-up email. We'll also include Melvy's contact information as well as the Kellen Foundation's information. So all of that will be in the email. And I know we're nearing the end of our time together. So if you have any last minute questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat or even to come off of mute and ask them directly. But we're so grateful that you all were able to show up today, and we can continue to grow in our knowledge so that we can be a more resilient community and work together to support our youth and our LGBTQ community. I'll give you guys just a few minutes here. Lots of love and support coming your way, Melvy, in the chat.
Again, thank you for the opportunity. I mean, the work Kellen Foundation does is invaluable to Greensboro and the community around us. And we just appreciate the opportunity to work with you and be part of this. And thank you to everyone who joined today. You know, we really, really appreciate your presence here and attentiveness. And we hope you did find it informative. Again, we're here to be a resource and help in any way that we can. There's no dumb question. You can ask us anything at any time, and we will do our best to get you an answer. It will be non-judgmental. You know, even if you think it's a stupid question, we'll get you an answer. We don't treat any question as stupid, provided it's asked from the right place. You know, that place of genuine wanting to learn. It is okay to ask questions, and we're here to help. So.
Great. Well, we thank you all so much for joining us today, and I hope you all have a really lovely rest of your Tuesday. Bye, everyone.